Let me introduce myself first of all. I'm a fellow of Corpus Christi, and I teach principally, and my research interests are principally in ancient philosophy. That's the philosophy of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So it includes thinking about philosophers, names you surely will have heard of, like Plato and Aristotle, and I have quite a wide range of interests across the work of those people, but also in the philosophy of the period that came immediately after Aristotle, which is often labeled the Hellenistic period. And that's, in a way, what I'm going to be talking about today, because the Stoics are a philosophical school from that Hellenistic period, and I want to say something sort of about the Stoics, but also about what sometimes gets called modern or neo-Stoicism. And I want to use those thoughts to help us to think about the history of philosophy. I mean the history of philosophy as something that philosophers think about, and as you might have recognized, as something that's part of the philosophy tripos here in Cambridge, and in fact most other courses that you'll find in most other universities. So I've called this Stoics and Broics. It's a silly name in some ways, but I hope it will make sense as we go forward. So here, just to recap, are two of the things that I would hope that I managed to do this morning. I want to take a brief look at modern Stoicism and offer you some thoughts about its relationship to ancient Stoicism, the kind of core and inspiration of this modern movement. And I'm going to use that to point us towards some general thoughts about the place of the history of philosophy in studying philosophy. Why would a philosopher be interested in the history of philosophy, I suppose, is my general question. And this is a way of illustrating that. I'm going to illustrate it in part by a sort of complaint. This is the kind of complaint that you might expect sort of boring scholars of the ancient world to raise, but I think it's a complaint that is important, it has important consequences, and it says something about why studying the history of philosophy matters. So what do I mean by modern Stoicism? Well, there are various things that you might mean by that. In particular, there's a form of Stoicism that you see illustrated in various ways on various kinds of media that sometimes boils Stoicism down to a set of conclusions, attitudes, or positive traits. So here you have, and you'll have to forgive me that the memes are a little dated at this point, but you know, I'm old and I can't keep up with the interwebs as much as you lot. But what you get here is the kind of association with being a Stoic with various positive features. And those positive features tend to be associated with being resilient, being strong, being confident, doing the right thing, not being whiny, not complaining, but being the kind of tough character that can take what life throws at them and recognize that it's a sign of their excellent character and their strong attitude to things that they don't feel themselves overwhelmed or broken or damaged by the kinds of misfortunes that sometimes come our way. So here you have various depictions of that kind of attitude, and you'll see that it's often placed in terms of a contrast between the tough-minded, resilient, strong-thinking Stoic on the one hand, and the kind of whiny, puny, less adapted, unthinking, non-Stoic on the other. So here we're told be Stoic. Be Stoic because being Stoic involves being strong and brave, doing the right thing, not really caring whether the world rewards you for it because you know you've done the right thing, not feeling bad if the world hits you in a certain way because you know that you've got the strength to face it. So that's where the kind of term Broic, I think, has come across, in part because I think here often Stoicism is being associated with masculine kinds of characteristics, kind of thoughts about being manly and resilient. Now, there are various other forms of that don't get boiled down simply to a meme format, and this sometimes takes the form of what you see on the left-hand side of your screen here as the kind of, so here's you can tell that here's someone being very stoic, right? So here's a Guardian journalist who appears to be sitting in a bath in her garden. And apparently she wants to tell you that from FOMO to illness to reputation, for every modern problem, there is a Stoic solution. So the idea is that Stoicism is just a set of, and sometimes you see it referred to this, a set of life hacks or a set of attitudes or recipes that you can call upon that will get you through your everyday life. Make me a Stoic and I will be happy. And there are organizations like the one you see illustrated on the right here called Modern Stoicism, where they tell you various kinds of ways to be a Stoic, and they say things like, living like a Stoic for a week leads on average to a 14% reduction in negative emotions and a 13% increase in overall life satisfaction. So what they're giving you is an instrumental reason to be a Stoic. You should be a Stoic because it'll make you happier. In fact, it'll make you 13% happier to live like a Stoic for a week. And what would be living like a Stoic? Well, again, it would be being resilient, not letting the world get to you, and so on. So if you want to sign up and see whether you can get to be 13% overall, get a 13% overall increase in your life satisfaction, be my guest. I don't think it costs you anything, though some of these places do indeed charge. So what does Stoicism come out as in these kind of depictions? Well, there are various things that they emphasize. A lot of the time, the idea is that Stoicism helps you to recognize and properly appreciate what is in your control and what is not. And it tells you to avoid negative emotions about things that aren't in your control, because if they're not into your control, you can't do anything about them. So why worry? That's the basic point. They also tell you that often these negative emotions and overall life satisfaction is generated by opinions about things being good or bad, and that if you stop judging everything to be good or bad, then you will feel yourself less liable to kind of negative emotions about things. So if you stop thinking that being beach body ready is a good thing, but you're not beach body ready, then you're not going to be upset about the fact that you're not beach body ready or something like that. Similarly, then, money, health, reputation, those things aren't up to you. It's not up to you whether you catch a COVID this week or not. So there is no point being terribly anxious about that. I'll come back to that in a minute, because it does seem to me, although it's not entirely up to you whether you catch COVID this week, there are things you can do to make it less likely. Anyway, so these Stoics, the modern Stoics, tell you to practice thinking about the things that you fear as a way of stopping yourself fearing them. So you practice yourself imagining death or imagining bad things happening as a kind of rehearsal. And so you, as it were, you familiarize yourself with that possibility in a way that will then make it easier for you to cope with should it come about. So here are some examples of the ways in which apparently Stoicism can help you. So from that Guardian article of the person lying in the bath in the garden, we're told the following. I may apply for a rental that I really want and I miss out. So I apply the judgment of bad to this. I think it's a bad thing that I wanted that flat and I didn't get it. But is it still bad if the following week a better or cheaper place comes on the market? Well, no. So if we treat most events in a neutral way, we're less likely to get upset by things that happen. Now, I could say various things about this. I think it's sort of a strangely confused kind of example, because it's obviously not bad to have missed out on the rental if having missed out means you could get an even better thing the next week. No one would deny that. I think the Stoic is supposed to say it's not bad that you missed out on this rental, no matter what else happened. But I'll leave that aside for a moment. But it's an example, I think, of the kind of everyday sorts of annoyances, things that could get you down, that Stoicism is supposed to help you with. Okay, so what is ancient Stoicism? So here's a brief kind of history lesson. So it's a school of philosophy founded in Athens by a character called Zeno of Citium. And Zeno of Citium founded it as what he thought of as a Socratic school. That is, it's a school that took as its inspiration the philosophical figure of Socrates. Socrates, the philosopher who had been active in Athens in the 5th century and famously was executed by the democratic regime of Athens and died in 399 by drinking hemlock and being poisoned. So notice that Zeno wasn't alive when Socrates was. So Zeno knew Socrates as a bit of philosophical history and decided that he wanted to model his own philosophical movement on the basis of the picture of Socrates that he'd received. In fact, it's likely that the picture of Socrates he'd received was principally through the writings of Socrates' great Athenian student, Plato. So Stoics read a lot of Plato. That's a quite interesting thing already, which is to say that even within the ancient period of philosophy, many of these ancient philosophers were sort of doing the history of philosophy. They were reading previous philosophical works and were using that not just to learn about the past, but as ways of deciding how best to approach philosophical questions of their own. They're called Stoics, by the way, because they tended to gather in a particular place in Athens called the super-curricular, or the painted stoa, in the agora, in the main marketplace in Athens. So they were just named after where they liked to hang out. And here are some Stoics. So as well as the founder Zeno, there's the third head of the school, Chrysippus, who seems to have done a lot of work systematizing and producing Stoic accounts of a huge range of philosophical notions. And then we move into the names that tend to be much more quoted in the kind of modern revival of Stoicism, namely Seneca, who was a Roman tutor to the Emperor Nero, writer and dramatist, who left various writings on Stoicism. Epictetus, who was a Greek speaker under the Roman Empire, and who left, about whom we have various works written by his own follower Arrian. And then Marcus Aurelius, who's this guy pointing somewhere, sitting on top of a horse, who was, of course, Emperor of Rome in the 2nd century AD, and who wrote a work called the Meditations, or Thoughts to Oneself, where he sets out various kind of Stoic perspectives on the world. And these three are the ones that tend to get more often cited. I think that's not inconsequential. They're cited principally because in their case, we do indeed have complete surviving works, whereas for Zeno and Chrysippus and the earlier Stoics, we don't. We only have reports or little scraps here and there. And also because Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius are Stoics who really focus on the ethical aim of Stoicism. So and insofar as I think these modern Stoics are interested in, as you saw, increasing overall happiness and negative emotions and things, those are the people they're most interested in. So what is it like to work on ancient Stoicism? Well, a lot of the time it involves quite complicated linguistic and historical work. So I've given you here a page of one of the great early 20th century collections of evidence for what the Stoics thought. It's by this German scholar, von Arnim. It comes in 3 not so fat volumes, 4 volumes actually, one's an index. And it includes various sort of extracts from, you'll see Greek sources here, Latin sources here as well, that von Arnim collected under various topics. This one is that the wise person is not affected by any evils. And so here are various bits of report from various different texts telling you something about what the Stoics thought. So in many ways, what it's like to work on Stoicism, from my perspective, is it's a lot of sitting in a library, and it's a lot of learning and working through texts that are in Greek and Latin, thinking about what exactly they're saying, why they're saying what they're saying, who it is that's saying what they're saying, and so on. A lot of our information about the Stoics comes not from Stoic writers. For example, one of these sources here, I don't know whether you can make it out, is by Cicero. And Cicero wasn't a Stoic. Cicero is the Roman statesman and quite prolific writer of philosophical works in the 1st century BC. He's not a Stoic, but a lot of our information about Stoicism comes from him. He was quite positively disposed to them, but not a Stoic himself. So that's something you have to take into account when you are bearing in mind the kinds of things he might say about the Stoics. Okay, so what does my work on ancient Stoicism tell me? Not about the conclusions that they draw, that you shouldn't care about things that are not under your control or negative emotions are bad for you, but why they thought that. It seems to me one of the most interesting questions is not what the Stoics thought, but why the Stoics thought what they thought. So here's one of the questions that I think that gets raised and is worth serious consideration. So you saw one of the claims of modern Stoicism is that if you follow a kind of modern Stoic recipe, you'll find yourself less assailed by negative emotions or bad experiences or reactions to things that happen to you that are painful in one way or another. And it's true that the Stoics said that the Stoic wise person or the Stoic sage would not feel emotions, right? I mean, notice already that's perhaps even stronger than what you might expect. It's not just that the Stoic sage won't be overly bothered by things, nor that the Stoic sage won't feel negative emotions, but rather the Stoic sage will feel no emotions at all. That's, I think, an interesting philosophical view, and it's something that's worth wondering about. In particular, why on earth would anyone say this? Well, to work out why the Stoics think this, we have to ask at least 2 prior questions. We need to first work out what the Stoics thought emotions are. So when the Stoics say the Stoic sage won't feel emotions, we need to know what they meant by emotions. And only then can we work out why a wise Stoic wouldn't experience them. Incidentally, there's already a question about, about the translation here. The word I'm using, I'm using the English word emotions. The Stoics in Greek use the word pather, and those are things that you undergo or sufferings or something like that. So that already, there's a good question about whether what we call emotions are the same as what the Stoics were calling pather, and that's something that a historian is able to investigate. Anyway, let me just set out what I think the Stoic account is that tells you why the Stoic sage won't be subject to these negative emotions that might stop you feeling happy sitting in your bath in the garden. And to really understand why the Stoics thought this, you have to go all the way back to the very foundations of their theory of value or axiology. What I mean by that is what they thought was good, what they thought was bad. And the idea is that for the Stoics, there's only one good thing, and that is virtue. And there's only one bad thing, that is vice. Okay, so the only thing that can be good is being a virtuous character, being a good person. And the only thing that's really bad is not being that. The Stoics also wanted to insist, perhaps paradoxically, that anyone who is not virtuous will be vicious. Okay, so the idea is that either you're good or you're bad, there's no in between in terms of your character. Well, what is it to be virtuous? Well, to be virtuous is, say the Stoics, to live in accordance with nature. What does that mean? Well, what did the Stoics think nature was? And this, I think, will begin to answer a couple of the points that are already raised in the Q&A. So for the Stoics, they had a general view that the world is thoroughly, divinely governed. That's what nature is. The world is, for the Stoics, a living thing. It's a rational, benevolent, divine kind of thing. And it governs everything that happens in the world so as to be the best that it can be. So that's an important aspect of what's sometimes called determinism. So you may have come across the notion of determinism previously. The idea there is that a determinist is the kind of person who believes there's one and only one way that things can happen, that it's determined, it's predetermined, if you like, that if something happens, it happens, and what doesn't happen was impossible. So a determinist thinks, for various reasons, some people think determinism is true because of kind of basic laws of physics or something like that, that there's only one way that things can happen, and they necessarily happen the way they do. Now, the Stoics think similarly. They think that the world and the history of the world as it plays out is necessitated. The idea there is every action, every event is made to happen and is necessitated by what's gone before, such that you can have this chain of cause and effect that means right from the very beginning of the world, it was always going to turn out in every detail, more or less, the way that it does turn out. What the Stoics add to that is the idea that, and what's more, it's good that it does this. It's good that it does this because it does this in part because it's being driven and guided by this divine nature that's present throughout the cosmos and makes things happen so as to be the best possible. Now, if that's the case, if you were to believe that, if you had this very, very general idea that the world around you was thoroughly and divinely and benevolently governed, and everything that happens was being made to happen according to this plan, if you like, according to this view of how things should be, then it would make sense, I think, to say that, well, the right thing to do is to live according to that, is to live according to how nature goes. There's an image, I think, in Epictetus that says, well, all of us are like dogs tied by a lead to the back of a cart. Wherever the cart goes, the dog will go. It will be taken in that direction. But what the wise person does is, the wise person is like a dog that willingly follows along wherever the cart leads, whereas the rest of us, foolish people, think we could strive against what's going to happen. So we're like recalcitrant dogs who are going to be dragged along whether we like it or not, but we might be, it's a much more complicated, painful, and discomforting process because we don't recognize that we should follow along. Now, that I think explains in a way why the Stoics say a wise man will not be afflicted by any bad emotions. Why is that? Well, here's another bit of Stoicism that you don't necessarily see explained in the modern account. They say that to experience emotion is to have a kind of judgment, is to make a judgment about something. And you make a judgment about something because the world presents itself to you in a kind of way. It says to you, this is good or this is bad. So let's say you're running for the bus this morning and the bus takes off before you get there. The world is as it might say to you, that's a bad thing. You missed the bus. But you only feel the emotion if you accept that impression and you assent to it. You judge for yourself, yes, it is a bad thing that I missed the bus. And that judgment is what constitutes your emotion of regret or anger or frustration or whatever. Now, since, as we've seen, the Stoics say that, in fact, the only good thing is virtue and the only bad thing is vice, then it's not a bad thing that you missed the bus. It's a very simple kind of question, because missing the bus doesn't make you a vicious person, and so it's not a bad thing. It's not bad because it's not vice itself. So if I think that missing the bus is a bad thing, I'm thinking something false. I'm thinking something that's simply incorrect. So to have an emotion is to make a judgment that's false. I'm falsely thinking that something is bad, which isn't bad, or in fact, I'm falsely thinking that something is good that isn't good. So positive emotions too are not something a Stoic wise man would feel, because a positive emotion would be something like, wow, it's great that I got a good mark in my mock A levels. Well, it's not a good thing that you got a good mark in your A levels, say the Stoics, because that's the only good thing is virtue. And so anything else isn't in fact good. So you shouldn't feel that emotion because you should not form the judgment that that is a good thing. Okay. So if I get angry because someone pushed into a queue in front of me, and because I think that is something bad, that's me forming an emotion, becoming angry, but it isn't bad because the only bad thing is vice. And since this thing is therefore not bad, then I'm making a false judgment when I get angry. And since the Stoic sage will not make false judgments, the Stoic sage doesn't get angry. The Stoic sage doesn't get excited about things other than virtue, doesn't get angry about anything that's not really bad. So what it is to be virtuous is to have the right views about what's good and bad, and regularly to form judgments that are consistent with that view. That's what being a good person is. So you can see where these kind of modern Stoics are coming from when they tell you that it's not good for you to get angry about things. But that's very different, I think, from why the Stoics think the same thing. I find it unlikely that many of these modern Stoics are basing their view on this kind of global picture of nature being necessitated and benevolent and divinely rationally governed that the Stoics base their view upon when they come to think what's good and bad. In a way, they get it the wrong way around. The modern Stoics might be saying, it's bad to get angry all the time, so you should try to get yourself not to think of certain things as good or bad. The Stoics instead think differently. They think, well, it's just not true that these things are good or bad. And that's why you shouldn't get angry about them all the time. They're not telling you not to get angry because they think that's bad for you. They're telling you not to get angry because that is just to get things wrong. That's to be mistaken about what's good and what's bad. Okay, so let's just take a pause and think what we've had to do so far. What we've had to do is consider not just the conclusion of a Stoic viewpoint. What we've been doing is not just taking the Stoics' thought X and applying that to our lives. The Stoics say negative emotions are bad. Okay, well, I will now not have negative emotions. Instead, and I've summarized it a bit, but the position that I've outlined is a position that you can come to and understand through careful pulling apart of ancient Stoic texts. What we've done is we've tried to produce an argument, a train of thought that supports and justifies that Stoic viewpoint. We've tried to work out why they think the Stoic wise person wouldn't feel emotions on the basis of other views that the Stoics hold. So we've had to come to an understanding of what the Stoics' view of nature is. We've had to come to an understanding of what the Stoics' view of an emotion is, both of which are not straightforward kinds of enterprises, and both of which can generate interesting kinds of debate and criticism. Because that's what gives us the room to evaluate this position as a whole. We can evaluate this position in various ways. So, for example, do we agree, do we really think it's the case that emotions are judgments that we make? The Stoics seem to think that they are. They seem to think that actually emotions are strongly what you might call cognitive. They involve us making a cognitive choice, thinking a certain thing to ourselves. It's almost as if there's a kind of back and forth questioning going on where you say, well, this has happened. Do I think this is a bad thing? Yes, yes, I do. And that's what it is to have an emotion. And that's why, for the Stoics, emotions can be thought to be true or false, because they're judgments about how the world is, judgments about what's of value in the world. And so that's an interesting thought. That's an interesting thought about whether that's really what emotions are. Now, I think it's why Stoicism appeals to certain kinds of modern approaches. For example, you may know that Stoicism is often thought of in companionship with cognitive behavioral therapy, a kind of modern psychological technique, in part because what they're trying to do is get you to think differently about the world. But, of course, there are other things that you might think about in terms of emotions. You might think emotions aren't thoughts, emotions aren't judgments, they're different kinds of responses. You might think that they're responses that are entirely independent of what we judge to be good or bad. Since, after all, doesn't it seem that sometimes I can tell myself that something's not bad, but I feel the emotion all the same? Or that at one and the same time, I might get terribly angry about something, but recognize that I shouldn't. And the Stoic view wouldn't really have a very, it wouldn't be very friendly to those kinds of possibilities. In fact, if you look at the ancient texts, often you find Stoics being put into a conversation with people who think that. People like Plato, for example, who thinks that your emotions come from a different part of the soul from the one that governs your judgments. No, say the Stoics, and by the way, they think this is what Socrates thought, emotions just are judgments. So, thinking about that Stoic view has begun to kind of have these kind of ramifications, further areas of investigation and so on, that I think are philosophically interesting. And it seems to me, thinking about them just is doing a kind of philosophy. So, have I gone forward? Right, here we go. So why the history of philosophy then? I'm going to try and make a case why it's important to think about the history of philosophy if you're doing philosophy. Now, lots of university courses, including the one here in Cambridge, will involve reading and thinking about texts that are historical. And what I mean by that is not just in the boring sense that yesterday is history, so anything published yesterday is a historical text in that sense. Rather, texts that are recognized to be part of the ongoing story of philosophical discussion and debate. And so you will often see courses in philosophy include courses in various periods of philosophy. Ancient philosophy, which are my guys, medieval philosophy, indeed early modern philosophy. Descartes, Locke, Hume, Hobbes, Kant, Mill takes you to the 19th century at least. And you might even see courses beginning now. There's a course we run here in Cambridge on the early history of analytic philosophy, which begins in the 20th century. But there's a good question, I think, why it is that philosophy is interested in its history in this way. Because it doesn't seem, on at least one point of view, that it's necessary that it should be. Now, this slogan at the top is famously something that apparently was pinned to the door of a Princeton philosophy professor in the 1980s. Just say no. Now, whether or not that was his actual attitude, I imagine he was trying to be extremely provocative by this. There is a question here. Let me put it like this. Why should a philosopher have any interest in the history of philosophy, let alone need to know about it, any more than an engineer should know about the history of engineering, right? So if you look at an engineering course, what does that teach you? Well, it teaches you about engineering. It doesn't start with Egyptian engineering and then Roman engineering and so on. It doesn't tell you the history of its subject, not at least as an intrinsic part of becoming a good engineer, right? That's not, I think, thought to be a necessary part of what it is to be a good engineer, to know and be versed in the history of engineering. And you might say something similar about philosophy, and I think this is perhaps what that poster was trying to say. Because isn't philosophy trying to work out what we should think now about certain philosophical questions? What we should now think is the relationship between thinking and biology, or between what actions are good and what actions are not good, or what the relationship is between how we perceive the world and how the world really is, those kinds of questions. And those are questions that you can perfectly well pose to yourself right now. And you can answer them with reference to what modern science say about how perception works or how the brain works and so on. Surely then, philosophy really doesn't need to worry about what people in the past thought. And in particular, we shouldn't worry about what people in the past thought, because a lot of the time, those people in the past were basing at least some of what they thought on views that we now think are just wrong. Views about how the world works and so on, views about the relationship between the brain and consciousness and so on, things that we now think are just false. So it's not just that the history of philosophy seems to be not necessary, it might in fact be positively a hindrance to working out what we should think now about those philosophical questions. So what I want to suggest is that the history of philosophy isn't like the history of engineering. And that's why the history of philosophy still has an important place to play, an important role to play in the way we do philosophy. So it's not a history of progress and incremental discovery. It's not the case, I think, that philosophy in the past was sort of rubbish and has gradually got better as we've learnt more and more things about the world. In the way that you could make a case that engineering has been incrementally getting better, or physics has been incrementally making progressive discoveries about things, so that we now could start with a better view of the world than they had in 1900 or 1500, let alone 400 BC. So the relationship of philosophy to its history is different from the relationship of engineering to its history. And that's partly because philosophy as a discipline is formed by the continued reading and rereading of its past. That part of what it is that has made philosophy the discipline it is, part of why philosophers are still interested in the questions that they're interested in, is because they continually read and reread philosophical writing from the past. So it has this kind of iterative, cyclical process that philosophy is in part the way it is because philosophy used to be the way it was. And so just to break that down a little, let me give you three basic ideas about what working on texts from the history of philosophy can do. I think they can train you, they can inspire you, but most of all, they can perplex you. And I think all of those are important ways of being a better philosopher. First of all, they train you just because a lot of the time, the job of a historian of philosophy is to work out what the text is saying, how it argues, what it's arguing, and why. So a lot of the time, you sort of end up just trying desperately to work out why on earth this philosopher is saying what they're saying. And that encourages you to engage in this kind of reconstructive engagement with what they have said. Now, doing that's really important because to do it well, you need, at least to some degree, to set aside your own philosophical views at the outset, your own prejudices, and just try and work out what this person is saying and why they're saying it. And that is an exercise in what I would perhaps label philosophical imagination, trying to think yourself into the train of thought that this text is offering you. And to do that, you have to read carefully and attentively. And reading carefully and attentively is part of what it is to be a good philosopher. It's also inspiring because often what people do when they revisit these older historical philosophical texts is they find in them inspiration for new lines of inquiry, new ways of approaching certain questions. So you'll see regularly in philosophy people revisiting, reinvigorating, and taking up again trains of thought that they've now found in these historical texts. So here are two examples. From the second half of the 20th century, the revival of virtue ethics as a means of doing ethical thinking was at least partly inspired by revisiting and thinking and constantly thinking about texts like Aristotle's Ethics. And people suddenly realized that there was something there that they could return to and think about. And in fact, something similar is going on in metaphysics too, that people are finding ways of taking insights from these historical approaches and using that to suggest new ways of doing, of thinking about persistent problems. And the third, and perhaps the most difficult one to think about, is that it perplexes. So I found pictures of people being perplexed. I'm not sure what they're being perplexed by, but just imagine they're reading a bit of Plato, or they're trying to work out why the Stoics thought something. This is the kind of face that you end up pulling, and this is the kind of face I end up pulling quite a lot of the time when I'm trying to work out what's going on in one of the things I'm reading. And I think there's a genuine joy and a genuine intellectual and philosophical interest in doing that. trying to work out why on earth Plato is bothered by a particular question that he seems to spend pages and pages talking about, trying to work out just how an argument's supposed to work in one of the texts that you're looking at. That, I think, is fun, as well as it being difficult and irritating sometimes. But I also think that's kind of what philosophy is. It's trying to think carefully about these kinds of questions, and in a second order way, think carefully about how you go about asking these kinds of questions. That's perhaps the best thing that thinking about the history of philosophy does, is by making you confront difficult, challenging, and sometimes surprising thoughts, articulated, argued in an expansive, detailed, and intelligent way. It offers you models for your own thinking. It offers you grist to the mill when you want to support something. It offers you a kind of grit in the oyster that might irritate you enough that it generates a new and interesting thought in you. And I think that's why philosophers continually revisit these historical texts. And they do so not to find nuggets of wisdom, nuggets of truth that you can then just apply to make your world better, but because by doing so just is intrinsically philosophical. And that's why the history of philosophy matters. So to summary, yes, some of doing the history of philosophy is a matter of pure historical research. It's finding the text, saying what it says. But it's almost always a kind of historical research that requires you to do philosophical thinking while you're at it. Thinking about why this argument goes the way it does, that's a philosophical question as much as it is a historical one. And perhaps most of all, what's sometimes interesting, refreshing, and inspiring is when you find something so very different from what the mainstream current thinking is. And I think that can only be a good thing, and it will contribute to the health and the vitality of philosophy in the long run. So that's why I do the history of philosophy. I find it fascinating and I find it enjoyable. And that's in a way why I get a bit annoyed when Stoicism gets transmuted into the kind of Broic outlook that I think it sometimes does. So I'm going to stop there. We've got a few minutes. I've seen some questions coming in the Q&A. How would you like to proceed, James? I mean, have you been checking the Q&A, and are there sort of trends that you've spotted that might help me to kind of address as many people as possible?
I can feed you the questions, James.
Yeah, why not do that?
So I think you might have answered this, but I think it's probably worth just going again because we had a lot of questions about it, which is, what is the relationship again between Stoicism and determinism? So that's come up a lot.
So the relationship basically is that the Stoics do indeed embrace a form of determinism. So it's not the case that to be a determinist you need to be a Stoic, but the Stoics are in fact determinists, and they are determinists for a particular reason. They are determinists. They believe that the way the world happens, and as it turns out, is necessitated. And they think it's necessitated because it's being thoroughly governed by what they see as a divine rational principle that's able to make everything as good as possible. So that's why they're determinists. Their determinism is of a particular kind. It's a kind of physical, but also theological kind of determinism. But there are various kinds of determinisms that are not Stoic.
Okay. So someone asked about, did the Stoics believe in objective virtue?
The short answer is yes. There is a way of being virtuous, and it's not up to you what that way of being virtuous is. There is a way of being the kind of person who follows nature, and that's just an objective fact. You either are virtuous or you're not. Yeah.
And someone asked about the relationship between Stoicism and other parts of the world. Is it a purely sort of Western phenomena, or do we see it cropping up in other sort of philosophical traditions?
That's a very good question. I think Well, my first thought is I'm afraid I don't know quite enough about philosophical traditions in other parts of the world to be absolutely sure. Um, but um, there's a good question whether if you saw, let's say, in the philosophical thought of China or Japan or something like that, if you saw something that looked similar to a Stoic position, you know, if you saw them saying emotions are judgments or something like that, would you say, oh, well, they're also being Stoic? That's not, I think, an obvious conclusion to reach. It seems to me Stoicism is a movement that came at a particular time, that has its own history and so on. Now, there might be similarities between some of what the Stoics say and what people elsewhere in the world say. Um, but I find those fascinating and interesting. But I think Stoicism, as I understand it, is better used as a label for a particular movement that came across at a particular time.
We've got lots of questions about Stoics and the idea of virtue.
Yeah,
So I'm going to try my best to lump some questions in together. So sort
sure.
of, where do you feel their inspiration of what virtue is? Where do you think that came from? And how would Stoics define whether that was good or bad?
Right. So I think the short answer to that is that the Stoic notion of virtue came from what they took Socrates to have been arguing. And they took Socrates to have been arguing that virtue is a kind of wisdom, that it's a kind of intellectual grasp of how things are. In particular, that it's a wisdom that understands what things are good and what things are bad and what things are neither. And if you have that understanding of value, that you know what's good, you know what's bad and what's not, that's what would guarantee that you are a virtuous person. So, unlike, for example, other trends that you find in Plato or Aristotle, for example, where being virtuous involves, on the one hand, having correct understanding of things, but as in addition, having your emotions properly regulated and so on, so that those parts of the soul that you see in Plato are harmonious. The Stoics don't think that there are parts of the soul in that way. They think your soul is solely a rational or intellectual thing. And so being virtuous for the Stoics just is having a correct knowledge of what's of value.
Interesting. And then possibly someone's just asked about, is there any link between what the Stoics thought about the account of virtues to anything that Aristotle thought about the account of virtues?
Yes, I think there are connections. Um, uh, so I've been trying to characterize the Stoics as sort of reviving what Socrates thought. And Aristotle talks quite a lot about what Socrates thought and tries to offer you a picture which he thinks um, appropriately recognizes what Socrates got right. So Aristotle thinks, with the Stoics and with Socrates, that you can't be virtuous unless you have this kind of wisdom. But Aristotle disagrees with them because he doesn't think that that's all there is to being virtuous.
Mm.
He thinks that in addition to having this wisdom, you need to have your emotions and so on habituated properly. And the Stoics don't think that. In fact, they think you shouldn't have emotions at all, at least on their understanding of emotions.
Hmm. Someone's asked, and actually a few people have asked this about what was like the popular reception of Stoicism when it was developed.
Good question. So it's quite hard to gauge that, in fact, um, because the sources are a bit patchy. It seems to have caught on, at least enough that by the time 300 years later in Rome, Stoicism was quite a dominant kind of intellectual current, and quite a lot of elite Romans saw themselves as, in a way, being quite Stoic. And that's, I think, likely because they thought that Stoicism was quite friendly to things that were traditional Roman values of being disciplined and one's duty and so on. what's interesting is there's a kind of radical wing of Stoicism, perhaps a precursor of Stoicism, just before the Stoics get going, which are the Cynics. And the Cynics in Athens also think of themselves as acting in the tradition of Socrates, but they're proper out there punk, crazy sort of philosophers, deliberately acting in ways that they know to be provocative just to get a rise out of people. So it's a really interesting question what the popular response was. In a way, I would probably think that very few people read any Stoicism, but that's because a relatively few people read anything. But there certainly was enough of a movement that it lasted considerable amounts of time and really did take hold in the Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire.
Is there any, so someone's just asked, is there any sort of books or articles that go into the relationship between Stoicism and early Christianity?
There are, yes. That's increasingly an area that people are interested in. Now, I'm not sure I could, off the top of my head, point you to any, but it's certainly the case that scholars working on the New Testament and the kind of thinking and moral thinking going on in much of the New Testament, a lot of them are increasingly interested in the kind of Hellenic background to thinkers, especially people like Paul, who was very well versed in the earlier Greek intellectual tradition. So there's people in the divinity faculty here in Cambridge, including the professor George Van Kooten, is very interested in those kinds of questions.
Someone asked about, I mean, we've got so many, we're never going to answer them all,
Sure.
but someone asked about how would Stoics respond to sort of chaotic things such as natural disasters? What would their viewpoint be on something like that?
Well, that's a good question too. Their view is it going to be a kind of interesting one? On the one hand, they would have the standard kind of Stoic response, which is, look, is this thing making me vicious? Is it preventing me from being virtuous? No, then it's not a bad thing. Okay, so I shouldn't form the judgment that it's a bad thing, and therefore I shouldn't feel the emotion that corresponds with that. On the other hand, I did suggest that the Stoics have this view partly because they think that the world is constructed well, and so there's quite an interesting question about whether what the Stoics' attitude to a natural disaster should be, if they did indeed believe that the world is thoroughly and benevolently governed. They're going to have the kinds of questions that you see coming up in later philosophy as well about, should I think, in fact, that this is sort of part of a kind of generally beneficial plan for the world, that this should happen? By the way, I think that's something that Neo-Stoicism really gets very badly wrong, because if it really does suggest that we should be Stoics, it will seriously limit our ability to be angry at things I think we should be angry about, or sad at things that we genuinely should be sad about. I think there are times when I think something bad has happened, and we ought to feel that something bad has happened because that's the correct motivation to do something about it. And that's, I think, something the Stoics won't be able to recognize.
So it's really interesting, James. So I was listening, and I should have been scanning the Q&A, but I was just listening to you. Someone asked actually a question near the start, which was, do Stoics think deontologically or teleologically?
Good question. Sort of a bit of both. I mean, it's the general idea is that Stoics think that the general structure of how we choose to do what we do is in order to live a flourishing and good life, right? So they don't think principally, as I think a deontologist does, about kinds of action that are obligatory, kinds of actions that are prescribed, and kinds of actions that are possible. That's very much secondary in their thinking to what kind of a person should I be? That's what kind of attitude should I have about the world? That's their principal way of thinking. And how do I get myself to be that? So that's really, it's a very agent-centered way of thinking about ethical matters.
Okay. And then probably one last question, then we should let you get off, James. So there was a good question. Sorry, I've now lost it. Which is, so you mentioned about how engineering philosophy is not around incremental discovery.
Yeah.
Someone asked, how do you measure success then in philosophy if we don't have incremental discovery? So a student there is throwing the gauntlet down at you, I feel.
No, it's a very good question. I mean, it's right. So if it's not a question of incremental discovery, how do we make progress? Well, there are different ways in which you can judge progress. I think progress involves finding things that are interesting, right? Saying things that are interesting, I think, is a good thing. There's also sometimes a thought that although you might not make progress, what you can do is get better and clearer at mapping out what the genuine possibilities are and how different views relate to one another. So getting better at working out, well, if you think this, then you should think this as well. Or if you think that, then you're not entitled to think something else. So working out what the kind of architecture of the different philosophical positions might be in relationship to one another, that might count as a kind of progress too. But I do take the point. By the way, I think that's partly why philosophy is best thought of as a humanity and not a science.
Mm. And then I think probably the last one, and quite a few people ask this, if you were to recommend sort of an entry, a gateway book, a gateway drug to Stoicism, what would you recommend, James?
A gateway drug to Stoicism. That's a very interesting question. What I would do is recommend that you read about all of Stoicism. So not just about its ethics, but about its other parts too. I mean, and in fact, what I would do is recommend not perhaps a book, but there's a brilliant series of podcasts called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, which I think you can find it's something like historyofphilosophy.net, and it's run by a guy called Peter Adamson, who's currently in Munich, and he has a really excellent way of going through all sorts of super interesting texts in philosophy, right from the very earliest Greek philosophy, and he's currently working on some really interesting stuff. So there's lots and lots of things for you to look at there. And he's also, if you look at his page, he has some really interesting thoughts about why the history of philosophy matters.